Hello. So it's time for another round of your bedtime story. We are almost done reading Palace Wagon Family. So we were just at the point where uh, a rescue party had just started to arrive in their camp. There were 7 men in the relief party. One of them Virginia knew. He was the same Mr. Glover who had traveled with them until they separated from the main company to take the Hastings cutoff. He recognized Mrs. Reed in spite of her starved condition. When she could control her feelings, she asked for her husband and was told that he would be coming soon with another relief party. He's been trying to get aid through to you ever since the 1st of November, Mr. Glover continued. So Mr. Reed made it up over the pass because he was by himself and he was able to hike over the snow. Maybe he made himself some snowshoes. And he was able to get down to Sutter's Fort in Sacramento. And he just continually tried to get people to come and help. Like he let everyone know there are some people up in the mountains. They're in really bad condition. They need food. And so he just kind of didn't give up on any of them. So it was kind of a good thing that they banished him, because if they hadn't have, who knows what would have happened. He's been trying to get aid through to you ever since the 1st of November, Mr. Glover continued. He and Big Bill McCutcheon started out for the mountains then, but were driven back by the snow. We know. We couldn't get across either, but some of our people did try to cross on snowshoes in December. Is there any news from them? Eddie got through to Johnson's Ranch, 40 miles this side of Sutter's Fort, and sent an Indian runner with a message. What about my husband? Mrs. Graves interrupted breathlessly. She had hurried over from her cabin when Mr. Breen had shouted that relief had come. I don't know about your husband, ma'am, Captain Tucker of the relief party told her, but your daughter Mary was one of the first to come in. She would be, whispered Virginia. She had not yet been told what the snowshoers had suffered, and felt it keenly that Mary Graves had succeeded where she had failed. Now she learned that more relief parties would come until all the emigrants were across the mountains. The Donners, too? Patty asked, concerned for Mary and her brothers as well as Tamson's girls. If they're strong enough to walk, we'll take them, the men of the rescue party said. They distributed food from their packs in small quantities, guarding their supplies at night for fear the famished children would get at them. They had left packs of food at various points along the way. These, they thought, would be safe until the return trip, when they would be needed. Besides, it saved carrying them. The men themselves were exhausted and horrified at what they found in the other cabins. Relief had come too late for many. It had almost come too late for Virginia, but now, strengthened by the food they had brought, the men considered her able to make the trip. It was the 18th of February when the relief party arrived. By the 22nd, they had recruited all the people they considered strong enough to travel. Virginia felt that they were being recruited like soldiers, and brave soldiers they were as they started off in single file through the fir trees and across the frozen lake. The 3 men who had been sent to the Donner camp returned with one of Jacob Donner's stepsons, his son George, Mrs. Wolfinger, and the teamster Noah James. Elitha and Leanna Donner were also with them. How frail and delicate they looked. Both girls were already tired from their trip up from their camp in Alder Creek Valley. Every so often, Leanna would sit down in the snow and begin to cry. That's just kind of heartbreaking, because the Donners, both of the men, there were 2 Donner families, and both of the men passed away. So you can imagine watching your parent die and then watching people eating dead bodies. I mean, that is just a horrific experience. And it's a wonder that all of them weren't just sitting by the side of the road and crying. It kind of makes me think that she might have been, Leanna might have been one of the few sane people that, was feeling very emotional. Every so often, Leanna would sit down in the snow and begin to cry. Virginia felt sorry for her and asked Elitha if there was anything she could do. At that, both girls burst into tears and sobbed something about never expecting to see their parents or their little sisters ever again. What about Mary and her brothers? Couldn't they come? They're too weak. The relief wouldn't take them. Elitha brought out in hollow, jerky sentences. I can't keep up. Carry me, whined Tommy, struggling along with Patty and Leanna at the very end of the line. Virginia was not strong enough to lift him, and neither was Mrs. Reed. Those who could keep up were already far ahead. Walking would have been easy for Virginia if she had been stronger. No snow had fallen since the relief party came in. Now they followed their own tracks, two of the men carrying babies on their backs. The others carried provisions. Only two of the Breen boys had come along. The rest were willing to wait. William and Mary Murphy, William, Lavina, and Eleanor Graves, Mrs. Keysburg and her little girl Ada, the Reeds, Eliza Williams, and John Denton made up the rest of the procession. Nancy Graves was considered too small to join her sisters. Mr. Keysburg, because of his lame foot, had stayed behind and was now living in the Murphy cabin by the rock. Our roof, Mrs. Keysburg explained in her funny accent, is all eat up. Virginia laughed and said theirs was too. The Graveses helped themselves to it while we were trying to cross the mountains, she added. I don't know what we would have done if the Breens hadn't taken us in. I froze my foot. It still hurts me every step, but this time I won't turn back. Turning back now, Virginia felt, would be just the same as giving up to die. Already 10 people had starved to death in the other cabins. 5 had died at the Murphys, 2 in the Keysburg shed, and 3 at the Graveses. More were either dead or dying at the Donner Camp in Alder Creek Valley. The Murphy-Schallenberger cabin, poor as it was, seemed to have been especially blessed. Uncle Patrick's prayers, Peggy's careful rationing of the meat, and the Reed family's determination to stay alive until they were all together had worked a near miracle. Virginia didn't try to understand it, but she did feel hopeful until she looked back and saw how far behind Patty and Tommy were. God help them, she prayed. God help us all. Uncle Patrick's prayers seemed to have brought help. Would the men have come just the same if he had not prayed? Virginia dismissed this thought as unworthy, but she did try to go back and help Patty herself. Try to keep up, she begged. I know it's hard, but please try. Patty did make a noble effort, but the pretend food in the empty dishes had provided more nourishment for her spirit than it had for her frail little body. Before they reached the first hill, the men could see that she and Tommy were too weak to go on. Mr. Glover broke the sad news to Mrs. Reed. You'll have to send these 2 back to the cabins, he told her. They'll never make it on foot. We'll send some meat and flour back with them. Later on, there may be someone strong enough to carry them out. They're light, very light. We know, Mrs. Reed, but they're too heavy for you. More children may have to be carried. We can't burden ourselves with 2 who fail at the very beginning. So that's a really difficult position to be in. The rescuers have a point. If more people aren't able to walk, then they're going to have to carry them. So they're deciding to leave the 2 kids back. Mrs. Reed knows that that's a mistake, right? She's kept her family together and she's tried really hard to help her family survive. She has to make the decision, do I go back with the 2 little ones or do I go forward with Virginia, right? So she's got a really horrible decision to make. There isn't enough food behind for her to go back and there's not enough food for her. There's probably not even enough for Patty and Tommy, but they're going to give them a little bit of food to take back with them. But I can't leave them. If they go back, I must go with them. Mrs. Reed began to protest, but the men told her that wouldn't do. She would only eat that much more away from the starving people at the cabins. Keep on with your other 2 children as long as you can, they advised her. It's the only way. Virginia and Jimmy were ahead of her, Patty and Tommy behind. The poor mother stood there not knowing which way to turn. I can't imagine making that decision. I would have probably gone with the 2 little ones, the 2 younger ones, but then like they said, there's no food for her back there. So she might have died going back there with them. "What will I do?" she cried. Turning to Mr. Glover, she asked abruptly, "Are you a Mason?" Masons were everywhere like brothers, ready to help one another. When he replied that he was, she went on almost hysterically, "Do you pledge your life that if we don't get through, you will go back and save my children?" "I do," he replied solemnly, "on my honor as a Mason." There was more talk of the possibility that they might meet Mr. Reed and his rescue party, but it was lost to Virginia when little Patty turned and said, with dry eyes, "Well, Ma, if you never see me again, you do the best you can." That just is heartbreaking to me. That's a really famous quote, by the way, from this whole story, that Patty, who's a little tiny girl, tells her family, just do the best you can. It made them all cry, even the men, for she was so brave about it. For Virginia, this was the hardest thing yet. She kissed Patty and Tommy goodbye, feeling that it was forever, and they turned back with Mr. Glover. She and her mother and Jimmy went on, no longer a family. They had left everything else behind. Now they were leaving each other. Ahead there was nothing to be seen but the snowy Sierras going up and up, like giant stair steps with the tops of pine trees sticking out of the snow. Virginia couldn't forget their previous attempt to cross them and how it had ended. Only Jimmy was hopeful. He kept saying with every step he took that he was getting nearer to Papa and something to eat. So Jimmy was like, "We are doing this." He's probably like you guys' age. And so he's stepped up because he wants to be rescued. He definitely has the will to survive. All right, we will stop right there and we'll see what happens to the poor, separated up Reed family. All right, thanks for joining me with this bedtime story. Talk to you later.